We're going to start the Board of Education meeting for East Greenbush Central School District. Let's stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right, so this is going to be an abbreviated meeting for us. I think first on the list, we have the emergency project for SECRA. Wonder if are we doing a presentation or?
No, James Thomas is here just to kind of give you an update from Turner Construction.
Yeah.
Everything was put together in a short period of time. I'm grateful that the board
Yes,
was able to approve this evening. Go
So
ahead.
we engaged a couple of independent contractors. We received pricing about how the replacement was going to go at DPS. We gave the budgetary numbers to Jen. We gave that to Labella. Labella wrote a letter recommending, I believe right now it's not to exceed $150,000. We don't expect that we'll go above that. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
For the students that are here, maybe that were not here at the last meeting, we've discovered that the hot water heating system at Donald P. Sutherland Elementary School is in need of replacement. And so the board is going to be approving things that are necessary to submit these plans to the State Education Department for approval. So that's what we're voting on. It was discussed in depth at the last meeting.
Awesome. All right, thank you very much. Is there a motion to approve the SECRA review? All right, Mr. Buno, and a second, Ms. Turner, all in favor? Everyone's in favor, and I forgot to mention that Jen and Michelle is out today. All right, and we also need to approve the contingent actual expense. So this is the actual charges. So the SECRA review is a state
Environmental.
or federal mandated.
Yep, for the
Okay.
environmental review. And
Yeah.
then this resolution is related to approving the emergency project,
Okay,
which is the $150,000, and it will allow us to move forward. And Turner went ahead and got some quotes, so we wouldn't be going through the normal competitive bidding requirements.
all right, thank you very much, Ms. Mulligan. Is there a motion to approve this expense? Mr. Mann, is there a second? Ms. Phillips, all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes.
Do we know when the work is going to start?
So once this happens, Labella is going to develop a formal drawing and just some specifications. Basically, it's just a formality. So we can go through everything we've already received prices from. There's one other vendor who's going to give us a price. Lead time right now is 4 to 5 weeks to get all the equipment. That's the boilers, the indirect heating tanks, any kind of valves, pumps.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ms. Mulligan. And next on the list is our budget orientation workshop.
Yes, Jen Mulligan, our Director of Business and Finance, is going to lead this presentation with our guest, Mike Loss. Mike is here. Mike is with Questar 3 State Aid Planning. A little bit about Questar 3 State Aid Planning. It is a statewide service. It is not a service that is only provided to districts within the Questar region. They work with more than 650 school districts on financial planning, and they have a great deal of expertise regarding state aid formulas, and they also evaluate various state proposals in terms of how they might impact school districts across the state. So they're a great resource that we have here locally. So I'll turn it over to Jen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start out the presentation with just a little bit of overview of some revenues and expenditures. So looking at the agenda, I'll go through that, the sources of revenues and expenditures, basically off of the 24-25 budget. Mike Loss will go through a presentation on state aid to give you a lot of background on foundation aid, how that formula works, and some statewide trends, along with some East Greenbush specific data. Then we'll take after he's finished with his presentation, we'll come back and we'll have a preliminary look at our 25-26 tax cap. We'll review some historical data on our tax cap and tax levy. We'll also take a look at our 5-year trend for revenues and expenditures. We'll have a discussion on fund balance and then lead into budget considerations. So one of the objectives is tonight is not to get into actually seeing what our 25-26 budget will look like, but to provide some foundation, some background on some financial data that will help pave the pathway to evaluate next steps going into the 25-26 budget. So first, I wanted to start out with our sources of revenue. So the district's 24-25 total budget is $111.7 million. And it's primarily comprised of taxes, pilots, which are payments in lieu of taxes, which are basically, those are separate agreements that organizations, typically companies or other types of property owners, would make arrangements for. It's like a tax incentive for development within the community. So that those are other tax type payments. And then we have our state aid. So basically the main sources of revenue between the taxes, the pilots, the state aid, that really comprises about 98% of our total operating revenues. So obviously the taxes and pilots is about 53%, and the state aid is about 33% of the entire budget. You'll see that I pulled out a slice of the pie, that red section, and there's a little sliver next to it. So that is the portion of the budget that's being funded with fund balance. That represents about $6.6 million. And then the other little sliver is the reserves that were actually appropriated going into the 24-25 budget. So that's separated out because our operating revenues are not filling the pie. And that will become a bigger conversation as we work through the presentation.
Ms. Mulligan, quick question.
Mhm.
I hate to ask a question so early.
That's okay.
But state aid, a portion of state aid, and I'm wondering if this is correct, is also get funneled to the federal government, but through state aid. And I'm just wondering, is that true? And do we know the amount roughly, or the connection between what flows? Because I know last time we did like the restricted that comes directly from the feds, and I was just wondering.
So,
yeah.
okay. So what we talked about, that was at the last meeting, right? So at the last meeting, what we were talking about was some of the federal revenues that come in that are passed through the state education department. So this is like the Title I and the IDEA funds that we receive. That is separate and apart from this state aid.
And I'm wondering, is there other revenues from the federal government that gets funneled through the state that is represented as state aid?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really federal money.
Yeah.
But the state is acting as a pass through, basically ensuring for the federal government that the districts are doing what they need to do to be in compliance with federal rules.
Yeah.
So that's really the premise of the idea of a flow through. But the title grants are entitlement grants. You're entitled to the money.
Yeah.
It's just that, you have to meet the specifications and the state ensures that.
And only reason why I was asking, because last time we were talking about the risk of federal funds related to Title I through 4 funds. And I'm just wondering also with state funds, I'm wondering if when we're thinking about risk of changes in federal policy, as we're going over state aid and flow through, I'm just wondering how it all connects, if it connects together. So that's the nature of my question, just why I was asking.
Yeah, so I mean, the general state aid, right? I mean, so I'm not an expert on the state budget by any means, but, a big portion of the state budget is allocated for education.
Yeah.
The state does receive revenues from the federal government, but also that's probably also part of, the local taxes that are collected through state income tax too. So I don't know specifically how much of the state revenues come in from the federal government that funds this portion of our general state aid.
No,
It's not,
One thing I
it
would
wouldn't,
add,
yeah,
In
so,
years past, when the federal government has proposed changes in Medicaid reimbursement to the states, those changes have put in jeopardy certain revenues that the state would provide for schools. So if the state becomes burdened by some kind of a federal adjustment in Medicaid, they have to look at the impact of that on their overall state budget. And that with education, as Jen is saying, is education and healthcare are the biggest two sources of funding required of the state budget. If something like that, it has a trickle down effect on the ability of the state to make its adjustments to its own budget, but we haven't heard anything of that kind as of yet. But that is something I remember a few years ago was a concern. That the state would have to make up for revenues in Medicaid reductions to the states, which would cause them to have to shrink the amount of money available within the state budget for schools.
Very good. So basically over on the left side near the legend there, those items, you know, the large part of the pie is really our reoccurring revenues. So that's the revenue, the operating revenues that are coming into us every year. And the fund balance and reserves, the red and that little sliver is our accumulated savings that is helping balance the budget. Thank you. Please go to sleep quite quickly. The next section is just our expenditure categories, just to give a sense of what the budget is primarily spent on. 77% of our budget is on salaries and benefits. And then we have BOCES services, debt service, a small amount of interfund transfers, and then also other equipment and contractual expenses. Contractual expenses can be insurance, utilities, supplies and materials, textbooks, professional services, professional development. It's a variety of things that could be in that category. So really, when we're talking about looking at the budget, about $85.8 million of it is in salaries and employee benefits. Okay, so that is just a brief overview of just the revenue and expenditures. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike Laws, and Mr. Goodwin is going to just go back over to his presentation. So I'll just take a moment and we'll be ready to go.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you for having me here tonight. And so really the idea of kind of my part of the presentation here, we're going to talk about state aid. And really because of state aid planning's kind of place, kind of being a statewide service, you know, we sometimes kind of see the bigger picture, you know, because we're dealing with districts throughout the state. And so I'm going to try to give some context. And it's really kind of a good time of year because we really, you know, next week we'll see the governor's budget and we should have some more definitive kind of specific information for East Greenbush. But right now, you know, we're kind of talking more in general pieces, and I'm going to talk about some of the bigger picture pieces. And what I'm going to start out with is look at the foundation aid formula, because this is the biggest source of state aid for the district and for really all districts statewide. But it's really been a part of the conversation with this Rockefeller study this last year. So really kind of get into some of the pieces of that. Talk about the difference between hold harmless and on formula, and kind of how that division kind of, you know, districts kind of fall into one pot or the other. And we'll kind of give you a few examples to kind of show you that. And then we'll talk about expense-based aids, as far as kind of projecting expense-based aids for next year's budget. And then kind of talking about some of the bigger picture fiscal and demographic things that we're seeing in the state that may influence things in this budget or budgets to come. And really, we'll try to give it in the context. So we'll talk about the bigger picture, but then also kind of hone into East Greenbush and some of the different pieces here. So kind of starting out with the formula. So you all have to memorize the formula tonight. You're going to have a quiz on it tomorrow. So just hopefully you can all study. You know, when they created the formula, you know, quick history of it. There was a lawsuit from New York City parents back, and it actually started in the 90s. It took over a decade. It went through the courts, but essentially the parents were arguing that the state has, in the state constitution, it says that the state needs to provide for a sound basic education. And the idea that, you know, kind of the things that we support with students, that a student, you know, can graduate and be able to be successful, whether it's college or career ready, that kind of a thing. And so this lawsuit went through the courts, and it finally went to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court decided in the parents' favor. They said the state was not funding schools adequately, but they were specifically speaking in New York City. So as a response to that, the legislature and the governor at the time, who was Governor Spitzer, they created the foundation aid formula. So this is kind of where it came from. And the idea when they created it, they wanted it to be three things. They wanted it to be simple, which, as you can see, they succeeded. They wanted it to be fair, and they wanted it to be predictable. And so, fair is a subjective term. But I think the reason why it is so complex is there's so many different districts in this state. Basically, everything you can possibly think of. I mean, even New York City itself has the richest people in the world and some, desperate poverty. But, we see suburban, we see rural, we see just everything in the state. So to try to find a fair formula, it has to be complicated. And so I think that's, so we'll talk a little bit about the pieces and try to make sense of it. Also to give some context to this Rockefeller study that just happened. And then the other piece is the predictability. I think that's another one I think districts find frustrating, is that in theory, this formula runs and everybody knows what money they're going to get. But every year it's kind of a little bit of a crapshoot, because are they going to just let it run? Are they going to tweak it? So I think that's also part of the conversation too. So kind of just walking through the formula a little bit, kind of one of the biggest premises of the formula is that it relies on weighted pupil counts. And so really what they look at, the big thing, ADM, which is average daily membership, which basically means every kid that's on your roster for the entire year. So unlike enrollment, where they look at beds day, they look at one day, it's a snapshot. ADM would encompass every kid, if kids move, if they come into school, throughout the year, every possible kid that you could have, not whether they attended, but every kid that could have attended is so it's kind of a comprehensive measure of all the pupils that you have throughout the year. Then it multiplies it by an enrollment index, which is a change in enrollment from year to year. And then there's a minor adjustment if you run a regular ed summer school. So it's kind of a little bit of a bump they give you. It's not a huge weighting. But the other big weighting is for students with disabilities. So any child that has a disability, not only have they counted once in the ADM, they're given an additional 1.4 weighting. So quite a bit of weighting. And this could be for a kid that's extremely disabled in a really high cost placement, or a kid that just requires minimal services. They're all treated the same as far as the formula goes. So pretty significant weighting for students with disabilities. And this is when we talk about foundation aid, where some districts are hold harmless. One of the big keys is they're losing kids. Decreases in enrollments because the weighted counts are so high up in the formula, that has a pretty strong impact on the formula. And we'll see some examples of that later on here. So another part that we look at with the foundation aid formula is looking at student need. So there's a couple different factors. One is census poverty, which is basically, the census takes a poverty count, and, in addition to counting the population for purposes of the House of Representatives, they also do a number of different statistics that they study, and census poverty is one of them. One of the big questions or kind of issues people have had with the formula is that they use a stagnant number. They use a number from the year 2000. They haven't adjusted for it. So that was one of the things when we're talking about updating the formula. Maybe there should be something that shows, the poverty now as opposed to just that point in time. English language learners have a weighting. So students where English isn't their first language, they get an additional weighting. Free and reduced price lunch students, which is more inclusive than census poverty. Census poverty is a very kind of low number. The modern metric, it's about $30,000 a year for a family of 4. So that's a pretty low threshold to meet census poverty. Whereas free and reduced price lunch, it's more encompassing kids with needs that maybe make more money than that, but the families are still struggling. And then sparsity count for districts that have rural sparsity, where you have very few kids in a big square miles. It's a less efficient way to run a school, but you're kind of limited by your geography. So that's what we talk about, the student need measures. One of the big parts that's really kind of moving the needle for the formula is inflation. And in particular, because we've had really big inflation the last couple of years, that 8% that one year, that was the real driver of the formula aid. So on there, they have it doesn't work on the screen here. On the next to the part where it's where the arrow is with inflation, there's a foundation aid amount, and that the basis of that is what they call the successful school study. where when they created the formula, they looked at schools that had high graduation rates, where basically where they said, oh, this is this school's doing really well. And they said, well, what does it cost per pupil at that school? And they use that to kind of create, here's the basis of what we have. Of course, when they did that, they realized that the most successful schools, in some of the richest parts of the state, it costs too much. So the state actually artificially lowered that number. But the bottom line is that successful schools say they were supposed to revisit it every 5 years, and they didn't. So that number has kind of stayed stagnant. And so really the only part of this part of the formula that's changed is the inflation part. So
When you say successful school, do you mean like testing scores?
Yeah, so it encompassed a number of different things, but testing was one of them, but it also looked at graduation rates. So it was just trying to say, well, and that was kind of the question, is saying, hey, does this make sense? And one of the problems that the state ran into was they kept changing the tests. So you're saying, okay, well, what's successful? This is what you had back then. Now we've got different tests. It's not apples to apples. And so they basically just kind of threw their hands up and just stopped. They didn't. So that was, one of the pieces kind of with the Rockefeller said, they were saying, hey, that's something you should look at because, it's not accurately measuring it. You just kind of stopped. So then the last part, so kind of a number of different pieces here, but they look at the wealth of a district. In particular, the two pieces would be adjusted gross income of the residents. So they're looking at the income of the residents, but then they're looking at the actual valuation of the property. So the wealth of the land. And so the state does that in a number of different formulas. But here they look at it, and then there's 5 different ways they do it. And then you get, because it's a deduction, part of what they call the local share, it'll take the lowest number out of the 5 different calculations. But that's the basic premise. They look at your wealth, they compare it to statewide averages, and that's it. So it's looking at saying, what's your local capacity to be able to pay for your students? And so the poorer a district, the less value of property and adjusted gross income, essentially they're saying the less of a deduction you would have. So that's the formula. So when you have the quiz tomorrow, everybody be good to go. I'm sure we'll get straight A's.
It's a pretty good overview.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things we could spend days going through that formula because there's so many different pieces. Yeah, but that's the general. Those are the parts that are affecting the formula. So now I want to get into this concept of hold harmless and formula. And kind of what it means for the current conversation, because this came into play last year in the state budget. And so I want to give you an example. So this is not East Greenbush. This is a different district. But if you look at this graph here, the orange line represents foundation aid payable. So essentially, this is saying what this district actually received in foundation aid each year. But then the blue dotted line is showing what the formula calculated. Okay. So this is an extreme example, but you're saying they're getting way more money than they're supposed to, right? So if we go back to the formula and we say, hey, the formula is fair, right? Is this fair? I don't know. Probably, doesn't necessarily, if you think the formula is fair, then this doesn't seem to be fair. But essentially this is the premise. This is a hold harmless district. Rather than getting less money, they get at least the same as the year before.
Mike, is this typical of those districts you still have declines in enrollment?
Absolutely. And you're right on top of this, Mike, because the next slide is going to show you the different pieces that are part of it. So there's a lot on here. Hopefully you can see it here. But if you look at that red box that says number 2 on it, it's showing that TAFPU count, which we said is a weighted pupil count, and then we show the enrollment. And you can see they're basically it's the same movement, right? They're losing kids, so TAFPU is going to decline. In fact, this district, it's a 28% decline in enrollment over that 10-year time period. So they lost a lot of kids. And then the other part is that selected foundation aid per pupil, and this is really where it's looking at. It's comparing the wealth of the district to average wealth in the state. And you can see this district, because of their property values, it's going the other way. This is a Columbia County district. We saw a lot of this, the property values in Columbia County. So when we're looking at the 25-26 year kind of going forward, it uses lag data. So it's using data from the 22 year. And so essentially this looks to be symptomatic of the pandemic. People moving out of the city, moving into, to different parts, because we saw a lot of this in Westchester. We saw it in Suffolk County, the east end of Suffolk County, where the property values, and everybody's property values have been going up, but significant hikes in property values while they're losing kids, right? So this is really kind of, the formula is really distorted here in this case. So now we look at East Greenbush, and I had to use the more radical example because this is kind of ho-hum. You gotta, there's certainly a difference here. We see those years where East Greenbush was getting less than the formula calculated, right? A number of years, right? And so I'm sure you could calculate what that cumulative amount was where the district was really being shorted.
It was over 20 million at one point.
So it's
Over those years. Yeah.
Yep. So now in the past 4 years, the state had said, hey, we're gonna pay to the formula. We've owed this all these years. And East Greenbush wasn't alone. There were a lot of districts in the state where they were not getting, paid, including New York City, where they were not getting paid up to the formula. And so over the last 4 years, they've made districts whole. And so now East Greenbush is on formula. And if we really look here, and you can see the difference between that other district that we looked at, look at the Taft-Poon enrollment, right? Really pretty flat enrollment, right? Which you say, oh, well, nothing's really changed. But if a lot of the state is losing kids, then you're looking better, as far as that goes. And then really, as far as the property values go, there's been increases in property values, but not to the extreme. So on the average, you're more, you're below the average as far as the selected foundation aid per pupil, but you're kind of on the same trajectory as the average.
Question, because that makes me think about pilots, so where you're not getting taxed, but you're bringing in massive projects which have the propensity. And I'm just wondering, do that have an impact at all when we think about the relation to foundation aid not getting the tax revenue on top of an impact on foundation aid?
Yeah, if you had a pilot, it's actually probably beneficial because that value is not on the tax roll.
Okay.
So if especially if it's a significant one,
Yeah.
It makes you look poorer because that value is not reflected on the actual valuation.
That's good.
So that's a piece, and we've seen some where districts have the pilots come off, and then all of a sudden they look so you look wealthier, but really nothing's changed, right?
Yeah.
There's a couple districts where they've had decommissioned nuclear power plants up in somewhere like Oswego up that way.
Yep.
And it's like crazy because it's $100 million, in a small town or whatever. So those can
Like
have,
Scriba, right? Like, is that where it is? I'm just wondering, no.
there's a couple different towns.
Yeah.
But it's
Okay.
it's like massive.
Okay.
So there is potentially an effect, and that's one that when you talk about pilots, nobody's ever thinking really about the state aid part. You're thinking about the tax cap, and you're thinking about the actual pilot, but it potentially can have an effect. So now kind of just talking about foundation aid increases in general, what we've seen the last few years, in 2021, nobody got an increase because of the pandemic. There originally was going to be an increase, but in March, pandemic happened. By the time the state budget came out, nobody got anything. And I don't know if people were necessarily complaining because we're all just trying to figure out what was going on. But in 21 and 22, that's when the state said, hey, over 3 years, we're going to start funding the foundation aid formula, because the state had never done that from the year 2007 when they started. And so you really see those increases. And a lot of times you see politicians, they're prone to exaggerate, say, oh, this is record aid. It really was. I mean, historically, it really was record aid statewide. Not everyone was getting it, but on the whole, some pretty significant increases in especially the 21, 22, and 23 years. And then if we look at East Greenbush, really pretty similar to in that time frame, particularly that 23, 24 year, some pretty significant increases to get the district back to formula.
Just for historical perspective too, I think that we have to realize that the local taxpayer was picking up the share of not getting their appropriate fair share of state aid. So, it's kind of come in balance now where our local taxpayers aren't as impacted. recently, last few years, because of getting that money now.
It-
Right?
Absolutely. But I think it's also important too, just in the grand scheme of things, that this really is a historic piece here,
Yeah.
trying to get to that point. But we're not necessarily going to see those windfalls going
Exactly.
forward. We're probably more likely to see modest increases on the whole.
But the number should be at least be stable since meeting the form for us.
Yes. But it's interesting too, and I'll have a comparison. We'll look at the the other local districts. Some of the districts that it gets a formula and then they fall off. Like it's one of those things where you say the formula is fair, but it's also volatile. And it's prone to, we've seen some crazy things where things happen and districts all of a sudden it's significantly different. Some of the things, the wealth factors. There was a district down a southern tier, and Yoko Ono and her son Sean Lennon owned the property. They sold John Lennon's catalog, and now this little town looks like it's ridiculously wealthy for 1 year, one shot. So there's some crazy things that can happen with the formula, the way it's designed, which I think is one of the reasons why they wanted to also take a look at some of the pieces of it.
Mike, when Bob Lowry who's from the Council of School Superintendents did a presentation last summer at the Questar retreat for superintendents, he showed East Greenbush as an example using all of the factors in the aid formula. And he remarked at how stable the student factors were, the enrollment factors were, the property wealth factors were. So I think that's a credit to the community that during this period of time where there's been volatility, our district and community has been stable on a number of different indicators that go into the formula.
Yeah,
Hopefully that stability will continue.
yeah, and really the enrollment, really having steady enrollment, that is not what we've seen in the majority of the districts in the state. So that is certainly, you say, well, it's the same, but if everyone else is declining, that's certainly a difference. So now what I'm going to show, this is what we call the present law database. And this is this is what comes out after schools do their financial reporting in the fall, and so it has all the data from the prior year, and essentially, so this is the local components of Questar 3, and so this November database just reflects what's in current law, not with any modifications that the governor or the legislature might add, but it's showing you what the formula should be based on that data. And so statewide, about half the districts are hold harmless and half are on formula. And locally, it's more on hold harmless in the grayed out than are actually on the formula. And we can see East Greenbush here, in decent shape in comparison to some of the others. And again, this is just kind of where we stand according to current law now without any modifications. So kind of remains to be seen what happens going forward. But you can see for the districts that are hold harmless, there's some significant amounts, particularly those Columbia and Greene County districts, where what they're receiving is far different from what the formula says they should be receiving. And it really is a product of declining enrollment. And the property values in Greene County, we saw some big jumps, but Columbia County were some really massive jumps in property values. All right, so that's kind of where we stand in that present law database. Now, quickly talk about expense-based aids. So the basic premise of an expense-based aid, you spend it 1 year, you get aided on it the next year. And so for budget purposes, when we're talking about for like 25, 26, you're using projected numbers for next year. So these numbers are kind of best, kind of what you thought back in the fall, but things change throughout the year. So sometimes you need to make some adjustments in the budget as opposed to what just comes on the state aid runs, because that you have more knowledge now. You say, well, we've made it through this much farther of the year versus what we knew back in September. So sometimes you say, oh, you got to make some adjustments, particularly like transportation aid. You budget for it, you're budgeting for contingencies. What if we have to add a run? What if we fuel prices go up? So you're adding some of those things in. And as the year progresses, you get a better feel for, okay, here's where we think we're going to end up year end, because that's what you're going to be aided on, not the projection, but on what you actually expect. For BOCES aid, similar idea. It's what you spend with the BOCES as the year progresses, sometimes you need to add services if things come about. So that's going to change from what you originally said versus, kind of, as the year progresses. The farther you move along in the year, the better idea you have where you're going to end up. And then excess cost aids. So these would be for high cost students, could be in a public placement, like a BOCES placement, could be in district in like a special class. And these are students that meet a threshold, a state defined threshold of high cost. So so it would be for those kids or in a private special ed placement. But again, you're going to be aided on the actual expenses that you claim through, there's a stack system that they're claimed for aid. The UPK grant, and this is one where on the state aid runs, they show the maximum possible UPK grant you can get. You're only going to get aided on the actual UPK kids that you serve. And I know that in a number of districts where they get this big grant, but you're not able to accommodate all of it. You're only going to get aided on the portion of the kids that you serve. And then for building aid, it's based on the actual final cost of a project over a period of probable use. If it's a renovation or reconstruction, it's 15 years. That's most projects. If you do a building addition, it would be 20 years. And if you had a brand new building, it would be over 30 years. So now kind of just kind of some bigger picture things that kind of may be kind of involved in kind of the state, what the state puts out for aid and kind of maybe some of the ideas that they came up with last year. We talked about enrollment in the state, and this is the big picture. This is going back to the 60s. You can really see here, that first big bump is the baby boomers. New York peaked in like 1972 and then had a really pretty steady decline. And then the second bump up is really the millennials. So, this is kind of what we've seen statewide, and perhaps maybe there'll be another bump on the other end, but you can't think, looking at this, it's probably not going to be as high as that one was back in the 90s or early 2000s. So it's really indicative of kind of what's happening in the state, right? We've got an older state, people are having less kids. We're not seeing we're seeing an outflow of people from the state. It was a slower percentage this last year than the prior years, but there's still more people leaving than are coming in. So I think it's certainly, I think, something affecting the state, and I think on the other end, you've got an aging population. There's more of a need for Medicaid. So I think it's kind of a push and pull for state finances as the demographics of the state change.
Medicaid or Medicare?
Well, so the Medicaid piece, which would be the state's obligation particularly for the elderly, for some of the could be some of like the long-term care and that kind of thing. So some big ticket stuff, and that's kind of what we see in the state budget books. Looking at those out years, they're looking at those Medicaid costs. Really, there's more people participating just in general, but with an aging population. And I think seniors, you tend to have more poverty, too, as people aren't working and that kind of a thing, tougher times too, I think. So I think there's more of a push, demographically, there certainly seems to be the state's anticipating a big expense, and those expenses are increasing pretty substantially. So just kind of an idea for school districts, when we talk about decline in enrollment, so it's a 9% decline statewide in the last decade. And if we go back to 2007-8, the first year of foundation aid, in the blue, you can see that the mix of districts in the state, there's a lot more smaller districts than there were back in 2007-8, right? East Greenbush, you're basically, East Greenbush was 4,600 kids back in 2007. Now, a little over 4,000. So it's a decline, but it's not as much a decline as many districts saw. And really, from a standpoint of operating a school, once these districts get smaller, below 500, the opportunities that they can offer for kids and the efficiency of the districts, it declines. So I think that's certainly the state's looking at say, hey, wait, there's a lot more really small schools. And I say this because it does, some of the proposals that we saw last year, I think are due to some of these demographic changes. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. But one of the other metrics, when we talk about expenses for a school, the state looks at what they call approved operating expense, which is basically they're looking at the cost of the program. So they take out things like debt service for capital projects. They take out transportation, BOCES, tuition, anything that has federal aid or state aid. They take out the state aid, the revenue of that too. So they're really looking at what's the local cost of running your program. And then they do that, and they do it according to a weighted pupil count, which in this case it's TAPPU, not TAFPU, but similar idea. They love their acronyms. But basically the idea, it's an expense per pupil. And we can see in here the colors, hope we can see the colors here. The top line is red. That's the state average. So that's what's happened in that time from 2007-8 to 2024. And if you think about it, expenses are going up, there's less kids, right? So the cost per pupil is going to go up. East Greenbush is in the orange there. And then there's a comparison in the capital district. The average districts of the same wealth, basically the suburban districts with the same wealth, you can see kind of a similar trajectory as East Greenbush as far as the expense per pupil. So that's, just kind of gives you an idea kind of where East Greenbush stands in that. A little bit of the piece that the state average is probably going to be affected also. You got more higher costs downstate. So that certainly has a part. But I think the fact that East Greenbush's enrollment has largely stayed pretty steady, the cost per pupil, in some places, this is a real, really sharp trajectory where they've lost a ton of kids, but the expenses keep going up. And that metric was talked about with the governor in last year's budget, saying, hey, there's way less kids. Why are the cost per pupils going up so much? So, is this a basically questioning the state's investment? And that's kind of why I bring it up. And so really kind of the different things that we saw last year, and maybe those demographic pieces had a part to it, but the state required the Rockefeller Institute to do a full study of foundation aid, which they produced back in December, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that was kind of the thing is should some of these things be updated? Does it really make sense with what we're seeing, with our student populations? So we'll talk a little bit about that. The Board of Regents also this past September required districts to create regionalization plans with their local BOCES. And so that, again, trying to, looking at sharing services and trying to do things, maybe finding more efficiencies, that kind of a thing, or more opportunities for students. I think those, particularly those smaller districts, trying to think about that. And then the last one, kind of the more radical piece, was the state added an additional incentive for districts to merge or reorganize. So particularly for some of those smaller districts, that there's a lot more money involved, that they were looking to merge with a neighboring district, and that, maybe create a more efficient thing, but also maybe more opportunities for kids. So those are all probably related to those demographic things that I talked about, but were also talked about in the state budget book last year.
But if they were pretty much held harmless, why would they do it? I guess is my question.
Well, and
Did anyone do it?
but that's part of the piece there last year,
Yeah.
where the governor really looked at saying, well, we're going to get rid of hold harmless. And for districts that have it, yeah. So it's kind of but it's also the carrot and the stick, right? You can, squeeze somebody so that they're forced to do it, or you can incentivize it where it looks like a good opportunity. So, maybe what we'll see, the governor was kind of pushing that. That was kind of the rhetoric that we had kind of heard, and with the Rockefeller study. And then more recently, she's, I'm not going to do anything with hold harmless. So we'll see next week what happens here. But
Is it for real?
yeah, well, the cynical person might, yeah.
Elderly cynical.
Lastly, the last thing I have here is the Rockefeller Institute. The study was 319 pages, so I'm going to do the one-page crib notes here. So one of the things that they were looking at, maybe some ideas to look at different ways to determine student need. That census poverty, the new metric, what they call SAPI, small area income poverty estimate. It's a similar idea, but what is different is that it includes all of the children in your boundaries, whether they're public school or non-public school, which I'm not sure that's a huge deal here. Some places that's a massive deal because they've got large non-public populations. New York City itself, they've got a very large non-public school population. That's also, a lot of it's very affluent. So that changes that metric if that's included. So that remains to be seen whether they would do that. And also the free and reduced price lunch counts for districts that are on community eligibility provision, which I believe you have some buildings on that it seems to be an undercount of the measure. So there was talk about maybe doing something different with that. That successful school models that we talked about as far as using, what is a successful school? That was also discussed, maybe exploring that a little bit more. And then that idea of the local contribution, particularly for some districts where they have a lot of property value, wealth, but the people there aren't necessarily that wealthy. You see that in a lot of like the Adirondack towns where you've got, lakefront. So you got some big ticket houses, and then the people that live there all year are kind of struggling and saying, is it really a good estimate of the need of that community? And the study said instead of maybe doing a 50-50 split with adjusted gross income, maybe you could do like a 70-30 or that kind of a thing where it maybe more truly reflect the wealth of the community versus just the property values. Students with disabilities, I said that every student with disability got an additional 1.41 weighting, depending on, regardless of their level of service. The Rockefeller studies said maybe you should weight the students based on their level of need, that if they're getting a more minimal service, you don't get as much aid for it. And they also talked about breaking that right out of the formula and creating its own line item formula. That remains to be seen. And then they did have a piece about reducing aid for districts that are considered hold harmless. So, and they said it with a wealth measure. So I think it'd be more the idea that it's not necessarily punishing a poor rural district, but a district that's has hold harmless but is fairly affluent. They'd say, well, they can take a hit. So that part remains to be seen whether they'll do anything with that. But those were basically, and there's maybe not doing service to that whole study that was the 319 pages, but these were some of the bigger ideas that they were looking at that we thought were. So that's all I have for my section. Does anybody have any questions related to state aid?
So in that study, they accept the study. These are legislative changes that would have to happen, right? The governor and the legislature have to work together.
Yeah, that's right. So the whole study was non-binding. They're just recommendations. The governor and the legislature would ultimately have to approve them in the state budget. And I think in theory, they could do it outside of the budget year, but because there's money tied to it, it has to go through the budget process. So they would have to approve these or any changes to foundation in order for it to change.
So to really get a sense of where we might be, we would have to see the governor's executive budget first to see kind of what direction.
Yeah, I think the budget process is always, the closer you get to the finish line, the better idea you're going to have where you're going to be next year. And so right now, there's a lot of speculation. We don't know. Next week, we'll get a better idea. And then, kind of as the budget process rolls out, and hopefully we have an on-time budget in April, and you can finalize your budget, firmly with some good numbers. But typically that's, that process will refine until you get to that enacted budget and they come to agreement.
Now, last week, Jen talked about transportation aid and e-buses a little bit. That's going to happen? Right?
Yeah, so the transportation aid had improved.
I don't know if that's
because
something
we're
you can
counting
answer,
some
Mike.
of those grants, like the TIP money so it's almost like the net cost.
Yep.
Is zero after aid.
Yeah.
And the incentive.
Yeah, so that is a big advantage with these. There's some pretty significant incentives. So the fact that you don't get a penalty for taking the incentive, you get aided on the full cost. That's a big bump. They've also just recently they passed. So the bus is the assumed amortization. So basically, how long they think the bus is going to last. They had originally passed it as a 12-year, but now it's at an 8-year, and you're going to get aided on 8 years. So I think it's you pay out, but you'll get your money back sooner. I think is maybe advantageous. Okay, if that's it, then I'm going to turn it back over to Jen.
Thanks, Mike. Very much.
Thank you very much. All right. So we'll let Mr. Goodwin get the next presentation back up. Okay. All right, so now we're going to dive into some more details on how things are looking for 25, 26. Oh, are we in the right? Yep. Up there. Yep. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we have a preliminary tax cap calculation for 25, 26. The state comptroller's office actually hasn't released the inflation factor, but we do know that they use CPI for that. And that CPI level looks to be above the 2% level. I think it may be just around the 3%. So we have an expectation that it will come out at 2%. So this is what we go through to calculate what the tax cap will look like for next year. We basically start with what our tax levy was from the prior year. So the tax levy for 24-25 was at the 58.9 million. And then the next factor that comes into play is the New York State Department of Tax and Finance releases tax-based growth factors. So that's basically our assessment, increases that occur. They basically say there's been growth within the district, so that you should be able to levy a little bit more as well. So our tax-based growth factor was 1.0057. Last year, it's very comparable to last year. Last year, it was 1.0058. So that is providing an additional $336,000 or 0.57% of our tax cap. Then we have to look at, how our pilots affect. So basically, last year, we look at what the change in the pilots are. So last year, we had, meaning 24-25, where we are now, our pilot receivable revenues was estimated at $6,155,000. So that automatically goes into the calculation. So if we go down a little bit further, the red doesn't go on the screen. So if you go down a little bit further, there's another pilot receivable line for 25-26. So I have gone through all of our pilots. I've consulted with our local Rensselaer County IDA to understand where certain pilot agreements are, where some might be going back on the tax rolls, where some agreements might be ending, or just naturally some of the exemption amounts may have gone up in their individual agreements. So we're actually looking at a $300,000 decrease in our pilot receivable for 25-26. What that means is that we're able to levy additional money because of that reduction in that pilot receivable. And that's a $300,000. What that also means is what you'll see when we start to look at revenue estimates at future meetings is that there is a pilot revenue line. That revenue line will also be $300,000 less. So when you look at it, all together, even though our tax cap is at 3.22%, we are going to have a decrease in another revenue line. So in effect, it's about a 2.71% increase. Another component to the tax cap calculation is our capital exclusion. So basically, we start out with what our capital exclusion was last year, which is comprised of our debt service, less any aid on that debt service, so building aid, and any reserve monies that are used. So basically, how much do we need to include in the levy to support, that capital line item, that net capital line item? So through our capital project vote, we talked a lot about tax neutrality, right? We just passed a $116 million project, that was going to be tax neutral. So when we're looking at it in the tax cap, we look at our debt service last year. We look at what our debt service is going to be for the next year, and then also building aid from year to year, and any reserves that may come into play in relation to maybe debt that was left over from prior projects. When we look at that, there's no change. That means there's no impact on the tax cap. So you'll see the number from 24-25 was at $2.4 million, and then that yellow line is also at $2.4 million. The line is yellow because there is one outstanding item that we usually don't see a lot of fluctuation with, but part of the capital exclusion is related to BOCES. So BOCES has a rent and capital budget. So they need to provide us that information, what the BOCES aid is on that as well. So right now, this is assuming that there's no change in that, but we expect some sort of change. It's just a matter of what direction it will be and how much that will be. So that is an outstanding component. We will receive updated data usually by very early February. So that's why this is a preliminary tax cap calculation.
Rent and capital budget is related to arrangements that our district and other districts have to lease space to Questar for Questar classrooms, which we do
Mhm.
at Columbia High School
Mhm.
currently. We have in the past, not currently, at Goff and Red Mill. We no longer do that.
So last year for the board members that were here last year, you may remember that capital levy exclusion, we had an influx of building aid, last year. And that resulted in that increase in building aid resulted that we didn't need to levy as much because there was additional building aid. So that actually reduced the amount of levying power we had in our tax cap last year. This year, that's not the case. We're all even. There may be changes in debt service from year to year and building aid, but overall it's netting to be the same. And then the other component of the tax cap is the actual levy growth factor. 2% is not 2%, but that is a component right in the middle of the chart. Allowable levy growth factor, 2%. That's where we're expecting it to come out, and that is contributing $1.2 million of levy growth. So when it's all said and done, our maximum levy can be $60.8 million, which is an increase of just under $1.9 million or 3.22%. And again, this is preliminary. There could be some additional data that comes in over the next month and a half that could change this.
I just want to applaud Jennifer because this is the earliest that we've been able to provide the board with a preliminary tax cap in my 9 years here. And she really did a lot of work on this. So.
And it looks great. And it's odd for me to say, and it's actually interesting to even listen and follow like the summary because it's so to the point of what you're speaking to. No, but I enjoyed it too. Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Okay. So I wanted to take a look at this slide similar. We usually see it in all of our budget workshops. Just some historical data on our tax cap and tax levy. Basically, you can see the green represents the tax cap in since 2016 all the way current to 25-26. And the blue bars represent the actual tax levy. So that was what was approved by the board and then put out to voters on an annual basis. So when we look at the years from 2016-17 through 2020-2021, the average tax cap was 3.76%, and the average tax levy was 3.05%. So the districts always come under the tax cap. But in those 5 years, it was more closely related to what the tax cap was. And then moving forward from 2021 to 2022 through the 24-25 year, the average tax cap was 2.68% and the average levy was only 0.26%. And obviously the 25-26 tax levy is yet to be determined as we go through the budget process.
Jennifer, I just want to go back to the slide that Mike Loss shared and Mike Buno commented on regarding that same period in which we were, the board approved lower tax levy increases. Were the same years in which we were receiving those state aid payments back in terms of foundation. And the 1 year was over 20%. It had said it was going to level back to 2 to 3% in state aid, and it's about 3% projected right now in the formula. So those two revenue sources, major revenue sources, state aid and property taxes, there is a pattern represented by this historical data that shows that when the district was receiving more state support, the board was very conscientious about the tax levy. That level of state support has changed at the same time that federal grants have expired. So those are just important factors since we are streaming this for folks to understand. The board has done its due diligence to make sure that they're balancing everything in terms of the revenues to support the budget.
Ms. Mulligan, I'm just wondering, like along that line, I know previously we also spoke about how communities were impacted different. We got a lot of different areas like Skodak, Nassau. And I'm just thinking about when we change the tax rates, and seeing like the local impact, just to have that in mind as we approach the budget discussions, that we could speak very clearly and adjust the rate in a way that we think is equitable for.
Yeah, so one of the things when it comes to tax rates, you know, that's a difficult, we have 6 different municipalities that our levy is a portion to.
Yep.
And then we also have homestead and non-homestead property classifications. The assessment rolls are not finalized until July 1st.
Okay.
So what ends up happening, there can be a lot of changes community to community. Also, there are adjustments to equalize the assessment values in each of the municipalities, and that's called the equalization rates. And that can really distort how, you know, for example, we have a town within our district that hasn't had a full reevaluation in a very long time. So the state equalization rate is very low. So but some other towns, their equalization, their actual assessed values on their books are closer to what their values are. So that can really change the apportionment of the tax levy between the municipalities, which can create complication. So when we go through to say, okay, what is our tax levy going to do to our tax rates? If I showed you that, it would not be accurate.
I get what you're saying.
We can model what those tax rates look like based on last year's assessments rolls, but there could be significant differences that may not have the same results, and it could be misleading.
I get what you're saying. And I'm just thinking, like, just with the idea of us seeing a local impact, like so that we're discussing it very specific to the people that you know.
And we can look at that, but it would be based on that prior assessment data, and that needs to be very clear.
Absolutely.
Because there could be various changes that we're not even aware of. You know, even settlements with tax certiorari cases or new challenges, you know, or even new pilots that come in, you know, there's a lot of varying factors. But that is in some districts that may have, you know, only one town that they're apportioning to, you know, there may be more predictability on some of those things, but it is very complicated, you know, in East Greenbush when we're looking at how are the tax rates going to be impacted?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So this is, I presented this chart last March. So what has changed is last year was based on a lot of just projections. You know, we had about 8 months of the 23-24 fiscal year in terms of what expenditures and what the revenues were. And then we were looking and projecting that out all the way through 24-25. Now we are into 24-25, and we are seeing exactly how the spending trends are occurring. This is about a snapshot in mid-December. So this will get fine-tuned as we move through the fiscal year. But basically, I went through, and this is our first look at a fund balance projection and what our spending is and what our revenues are for the 24-25 fiscal year. So the blue bar represents what our total budget is. And this is a look over the last 5 years. So 21 through 24 is actual data. And then 24-25 is projected, trended based on 5 to 6 months of actual financial data. So the red line represents our expenditures, and the green line represents our operating revenues. So the budget has been higher than our revenues and expenditures year over year. We haven't been spending to that budget level, nor have we been receiving revenues up to that budget level. So for example, in 2021, there's a surplus. You can see the green is above the red, but there's a very substantial, I'm not going to call it gap, but just spending under our budget threshold then. So then we move on, our expenditures continue to increase. Our revenues are on the same trajectory. Okay. So in 21, 22, we're basically break even, but we're still well under our overall budget. Going into 22, 23, same idea. 23, 24, we had additional revenues. We had a surplus because there was building aid that came in. That was a major component of that. We had building aid, we had some interest revenue, things that weren't anticipated as part of the budget process. Then looking into, you can see now that green line 23, 24 going into 24, 25. That's basically a combination of two things. So most of our revenues are taxes, pilots, and state aid. And that is pretty much level going into the 24, 25. There isn't much increase in revenue there. However, our expenditures continue to increase at about a 4 to 5% rate per year. So now that expenditure line is projected and will be above the revenue line at the end of 24, 25, and is getting very close to our budget level.
Now,
ahead.
last week we talked about a reduction in federal aid, like Title I, and stuff. So I'm assuming that's part of
Yes, that would be
but
part
It
of.
doesn't look like it's all of it.
So that ended up being about $200,000.
Right,
So this
right.
is, $110 million of
Yeah.
expenditures here.
So what would be other things that would cause that red line to be that much above the green?
Basically just our salary contracts.
salary,
Yep.
okay.
Salaries, employee benefits, health insurance being a major component,
Okay.
retirement contributions to
So
ERS
that
and
just the revenue isn't
Yep.
growing at the rate that.
Right.
increased.
correct. Mhm. So if we look, this doesn't have 25, 26 projections yet, right? We haven't moved that far into the process. But, as we're talking about, we do have an understanding what our tax cap may look like. We have an understanding that there's going to be maybe some marginal increases in state aid. So that green line isn't probably going to tick up significantly. Okay. However, the expense line is going to continue to go up, and now it's going to go up to the blue line, over the blue line, which means that in order to maintain the same kind of program that we have, is that the budget would have to move, along that unless there were some other changes. Okay. So this is just a picture of that. And then I wanted to just show, like, from just a numbers perspective, what that means. So this chart over on the right side is what our total revenues and total expenditures. The top line is our 24-25 projected. So for 24-25, we're projecting that we'll receive just about $106 million in revenue. So that's actually our taxes, our pilots, our state aid, interest revenue, and some other miscellaneous revenues. And then looking from in 2020, 21, 5 years ago, that revenue was at $92.7 million. So that change over the 5-year period was an increase of revenue of about $13.3 million, which on average is about 2.88% increase per year. Okay. And then when we look at our expenditures, they're projected to be at $109.9 million. So keep in mind our budget is $111.7. Okay. And the expenditures in 2021 were at 89, just under 89.1 million. So that average expenditure increase per year was 4.67%. So basically, there is definitely a shift in terms of expenditures growing at a faster pace than revenues as a whole. So even though we talked about state aid, we received in the same period a larger increase in state aid, like over that 5-year period, it didn't keep the same pace with the expenditure increases. So then just going back to the left side of the chart, which is, Mike, you made the point exactly, is the shift of, because we got that additional foundation aid, is that there's been a shift of additional revenues from the state. So I guess the pie has changed. The pie used to show that there was a larger share coming from taxes than state aid. And now that has flipped the other way. So when we're looking at, overall, we're projecting that there's going to be an operating deficit of about $3.9 million this year. 5 years ago, that was at 3.6 million. So it's a swing of about 7.5 over those 5-year period.
Just I mean, I know you're gonna get to it, but.
Yep.
The fund balance.
Yes. Perfect segue. So this is just a elementary chart of what fund balance is. It's basically our revenues less our expenses equals our surplus and our deficit, and how they've accumulated over the years. So in a year that we have a surplus, we're able to, save that. We have to look at 4% of our unassigned fund balance. We do have some requirements to, not exceed that. But basically, fund balance is an accumulation of surpluses over the year. It's important for financial stability, risk management. Things come up during the year. For example, DPS hot water project, that's small in the grand scheme of things, but it's still, those things do happen and things come up. Other initiatives or priorities may come up during the year that, so you want to make sure that you have some contingencies built in. Mike had mentioned, an extra transportation run. There are things that happen. Students are coming and going within the district and needs change during the year that aren't necessarily anticipated at the time the budget is being developed. So basically, long and short is you want your budget level to be higher than what your actual expenditures are going to be to allow for those fluctuations. So this chart's complicated, and I just wanted to offer that. I wanted to put some context, because I think it's important just to have the information out there. And I'd be more than happy to walk through it in grave detail with anybody. So I invite you, call me. I can sit and I can walk through it. But the reason I wanted to show it is because our total revenue expenditures in that top part of the chart is what you'll see in our financial statements. Okay, so when you look at our financial statements in 22-23 and you see a deficit of $49,000, well, it really wasn't. We were able to put money away in reserves. In 23-24, we had, a larger surplus, mainly because of that additional building aid and some interest revenues. But what is the impact of that? So there's revenues and expenditures in those categories that have a direct impact on our different reserve categories. So there's bus purchase expenditures in those expenditures that impact, that reduce our bus purchase reserve account. There's transportation aid for those bus purchases that come in that our reserve is set up, that was approved by the voters for that aid to go right into that reserve account. So you really have to break down that surplus deficit to determine what is the operating related surplus deficit that's not connected to any of our reserve accounts. So when you look at 22-23 and you drill down right to the bottom, right above the total surplus deficit line, there's a balance available to fund reserves. So even though in that year we had a $49,000 deficit, when all the cards were shook out, for the activity related to our reserve funds, we were able to put $810,000 into our reserve and maintain that 4% level of unassigned fund balance. And that's the same theme going into 23-24. Now, when we look forward to 24-25, we now are looking at an operating deficit, and you see the balance to fund reserves at the bottom now. Based on this, there wouldn't be any new money that would be able to be funded into those reserve accounts. So I highlighted some areas in blue and in the 24-25 column. So when I mentioned before, okay, our operating deficit is $3.8 million. Not all of it is hitting our non-reserve or unassigned fund balance. Part of it, as part of the budget process, the board had authorized use of certain reserves to help offset some of those expenses. So there was one of our retirement reserves for the employees' retirement system was appropriated to help fund that. So part of that deficit is being funded by that reserve account. And then EBLAR is our employee benefits liability. So when we have retirement incentive payments, we're also using some of that reserve to pay some of the expenses that are projected.
But just want to make a comment on that. Part of that reason was because the tax cap was so darn low last year.
Yes.
That's right.
And, we didn't
Unfortunately,
have a project to the override, so, we have to take money from someplace.
Yes.
I think the situation seems to have shifted for us
Mhm.
based on projections for the next year.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
And then represents some options. It's a point. I think you have to keep that in mind.
Yes, yes. So when we break
Your
down,
tax cap last year was like
0.55%.
So, right, and
Right.
you had a big project out to the community. So,
Right,
but-
right.
But
We paid this.
now we're in a situation though where we really are going to deplete at the end of this year some of that fund balance, and we want to be more cautious about, you
Mhm.
know, asking the board to give consideration to a tax levy increase that is more in line with what the average has been over the last several years. Certainly within the cap, but we also, and we're going to get to this. We do need to make some expenditure reductions, what those will be. And you need to do all three things to remain your fiscal stability. You need to cut expenditures where you can with, the idea that you try to do as much as you can to reduce expenditures moving forward without hurting program, without hurting kids, without hitting the classroom. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. But we have to have those tough conversations. You don't want to run out of money by continuing to dip into your reserves when your state aid is only going to be about 3% per year. Best case scenario to some degree based on the foundation aid formula if it stays the same. And you want to be cautious to try to make sure that when you are utilizing those reserves that you're anticipating, if you can use them for one-time expenses as opposed to recurring expenses that are going to get higher. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we're going to have moving forward, but we want to start with the data. And I think Jennifer was pretty spot on last year at the presentation at Red Mill. Maybe some things may change a little bit between now and the end of the year, but not a lot.
Mhm.
You keep in mind that the earlier presentation is we're in better shape as far as state aid is and stability than many, many districts in the state of New York.
Right.
Mhm.
Yep.
But I just want to remind you too, we talked about this.
Yes,
This
we did.
possibility.
we did.
And, if funds kept came in at a level that was going to be higher and impact the committee, we have to make those decisions about what that level is going to be. And, we've been talking about it for years.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yep.
And it's coming.
Sorry, Jen.
No, that's okay. So this is basically the activity and how, the year-end results and how they impact reserves. So, be good reading some night and feel free to give me a call. So this is our complete fund balance picture, including reserves, the actual from the last 2 years, and then rolling forward the projected in 24-25. The top part, so I segmented these and I call these, they're not technical, I call them operating reserves because they're more related to our general operating expenses. So there's unemployment, workers' comp, retirement reserves related to ERS and TRS and our EVLAR. So those are areas that there's opportunities to save, really look at as to what level should they be at, how should they be maintained, or be used, to help support the budget. So our total operating reserves you can see there's stability. The 2 years ago was 13.6, increase. We did some more funding last year, 14.4. And that is staying relatively steady. Now, one may say, okay, I thought we appropriated $680,000. We did. However, we're projected, just the 2 lines below that second gray, we're projecting that there's going to be $760,000 in reserve investment earnings that are going to come in that will help stabilize and offset that utilization for this
To your
next
credit.
year. I'm sorry?
To your credit, you basically have, through the investments that have been made, replenished the reserves that were allocated last year.
Right.
So I said, to your credit.
Oh, thank you.
Credit where credit is due.
So that's why, even though we did do an appropriation, we were able to maintain that level and replenish those with some of those earnings. Then we have our non-operating reserves, which is our capital project, our bus purchase. So those need voter approval to spend. And obviously there's a big decrease in this category because part of the voter approved project was that we had a $2 million capital reserve that was appropriated to help fund the project. So some of those monies were transferred at the end of last year. We had some preliminary pre-referendum costs, and then that reserve was fully appropriated into this year because it's paying for costs of the project prior to issuing debt related to that project. So the balance of that is $3.2 million. We also historically, I included our tax certiorari. So historically, we make sure we set aside funds on an annual basis for any outstanding claims that we may have. And that's reevaluated every summer based on any filings that have come into the district or have been closed or settled during the year. The next category I'm going to get into more on the next slide because it gets a little bit further. But before I do that, you know, when we look at our total fund balance, it's been, you know, 30 million in 22-23, 31.5 million at the end of the year. And then there's going to be the decline of the 26 million. Now, remember I said that the operating deficit is at 3.8, right? But, oh, what's that 5.3 million? If we go back to that previous chart, the 24-25 deficit includes some spending on reserves. So the bus purchase expenditures are in there. The transfer to appropriate that capital reserve is in there. So those are basically being assigned to those specific reserve categories. So overall, our reserves are going down by 5.3 million. When we look at what our assigned and unassigned fund balance is, there's encumbrances, which are outstanding purchase orders at the end of the year. That's basically carrying over the prior year budget into the new year based on commitments that were made. And then we have what's appropriated for next year's budget. So this is that, going back to the very first slide, when we're looking at how are we funding our budget, that was that red piece of the pie that was pulled out. Okay, so that is the portion of fund balance that is helping support the budget. And then if you go back to the other chart that had the lines, the blue, yellow, the blue, green, and red lines, you remember that gap was very large. I'm going to go back there. So back in 2021, there was a large difference. So obviously that fund balance helped support the budget, but we didn't need to spend it. We never got to that level. So it just carried year over year. It was $6.8 million for several years here. It just stayed steady. It was never needed. So basically, when we're looking at our total assigned and unassigned fund balance, that's really the portion that has been used to balance the budget. And one of those components is our unassigned 4%, which is basically our contingency and help maintain cash flow. So let's look at that section a little bit closer. So I know, Mike, you have asked in the past, like, where is that 6.8 million? You know, where is that, you know, in the financial statements? And it's really part of this $11 million number. It's the accumulation of the 4%, the portion that's assigned for those outstanding purchase orders, and also what's being assigned for next year's budget. So you can kind of look at that holistically as to what is available and how that's going to be impacted. So that's projected to decrease by $3.2 million. So going from 11.8 million to 8.6 million in 24-25, which is a 27% decrease.
And you're saying this year?
Yes, this year.
Yeah.
This year. So when you look at that, now this is just an example. You can see how I place that. I don't know what our outstanding encumbrances are going to be at this point in time, so I assumed it would be the same. It basically just reclassifies between these categories, depending on what the level is that's outstanding. And then we have our unassigned fund balance at 4%. Obviously, our budget may increase, you know, going into next year, so that 4% level should also increase. So when you apply that deficit, if the policy of the board is to maintain that 4% and not dip into that, the amount that's available for next year's budget, and that won't be available if it's used in 25-26, is $3.4 million. Okay. So here's an example. So basically, we saw that the appropriated fund balance and reserves. So we're taking a look at this section of that budget again. is the 24-25 budget. This is that piece that we saw, that red piece of the pie, that 6.6 million. And then we see that 680,000, those two other components was that really little silver piece. So we basically had a structural budget deficit of $7.2 million. Okay. That was, closing the budget between the difference between the projected operating revenues that were budgeted and the expenses. When we apply that $3.2 million deficit, that picture changes to 3.3 million. And then if we continue to appropriate the ERS reserve, and there's decisions that need to be considered as to, is it 400? Is it more? Is it less? Okay. But this is just an example. So when we appropriate reserves and they're maintained at the same level, it doesn't provide additional air quotes, quote unquote, revenue in terms of supporting your budget, only changes in increasing those amounts. We also talked about last year is, the next step would be to start to look at appropriating that TRS reserve to help support the budget. So that would help offset any decreases in the appropriation of next year's budget. So basically that's an equivalent, before we talk about any new revenues for next year, this is in essence a revenue decrease. That's monies that are available to support next year's budget. And this is just an example. I want to make that very clear. Obviously there's a lot of things that need to go in there, but wanted to.
Did the TRS and ERS rates go up that much?
TRS is anticipated, it's 10.11% for 24-25. It's expected to be around there, around 10. ERS, the rates have been going up, but it's an interesting because there's a shift between tier 4 and tier 6. In TRS, that's blended, but in ERS, each tier has a different contribution rate. And as the population ages, there's less tier 4 members, which is a higher contribution rate, and there's more tier 6 members, which is at a lower contribution rate. So depending on our mix of employees or retirement, things shift there. I honestly, I would have to get back to you. I don't know. I have it in a spreadsheet, but it's been a little while since I looked at it.
I'm just looking at just the observer.
Yep.
You have to tell it.
Mhm. Actually, I'm not expecting outside of the impact of any salary increases on that, any significant changes in those rates. And actually, the pension exclusion that's usually can be part of the tax cap. There isn't one this year either. So this is an important component, just to really consider that if we're spending up to that budget level, and that this is there's going to be less money to help balance it before we even talk about expenditure increases next year. So these are the considerations to just to pave that pathway. Decreasing fund balance, increasing expenditures, and limited revenue growth is a concern for stability. So basically that reliance on fund balance is about 6% of our total revenues. Let's just say that fund balance was just that part that was it's equivalent to increasing the tax levy by 11% to close that gap. If everything was going to stay equal, if there was going to be a shift on reliance, that's what it would be equivalent to.
If the budget stayed the same.
If the budget stayed the same, everything held equal.
Yeah.
You remove that piece of the pie and it's replaced. It's just equivalent to that. So it's just to get an understanding of what that measure is. So the ability to appropriate that non-reserve portion, things outside of the reserve, is expected to no longer be available by the time we get to the conversations this time next year for 26-27 budget process. So basically 3 options, increase the tax levy, cut expenditures, or a combination of 1 and 2. And I don't think it can be done without the combination of 1 and 2.
Yeah, for
When you
sure.
say number 1, increase the tax levy. What are you saying?
Increase the tax levy to the extent you can, which would be
Not
the
above
tax
the
cap.
3.22. You mean to the cap or above the cap?
She
I don't know
didn't-
what
Those
she
are
didn't
for
say. She
future,
didn't
those,
say. TBD.
yeah, it is
Mike?
TBD.
Increase the tax levy.
Yep.
It says that.
Period.
It
Yeah,
does.
That
Yeah.
means
Tax cap We talked about it.
We did talk about the
Like-
tax
For
cap.
consideration.
I would frame it as,
She
I would
don't
frame
mean
it as what I said
0.55.
earlier, to be more consistent with the average tax levy increases that East Greenbush has experienced over the last 10-year periods. And we would strive to be within the cap.
Within
But
the
you
cap.
cannot be within the cap unless you make expenditure cuts or appropriate a dangerous level of fund balance towards the budget.
My only challenge when talking about.
So you have to
Yeah.
work in all three, really.
Yep, and I 100% agree. And it's just for me, like I think looking forward, and I think just being very conscious about the expenditures that we approve, even between now. I think as we approach, talking about raising taxes, we should be very conscientious about any additional expenditures that might not be part of our current programming.
I agree with that, Jesse. And one of the things the board asked us to do several years, advocated by Mr. Mann, was when positions become open, we evaluate whether or not we need to fill them or not. And we have some positions that are unfilled now. I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the neighborhood of $1.7 million worth of salaries or something like that. But
About
Well,
800,000.
800,000,
Yeah, there's
okay.
some other things in there that, yeah. Yep.
it's not just salaries though.
It wasn't salaries. There's also some other things that haven't happened
Okay.
yet
but
this year. That
There's
was
about
aiding in that
1.7
projection.
of,
It was we have some monitor positions, some TA positions. We have some custodial positions. We have, I think there was even a teacher position. There was a variety of positions that were open. That number that you were seeing, Mr. Simons, there was a few other things like we have our club advisors that we pay at the end of January.
okay, so these are things that we
Yeah,
can't
so
fully.
they were, yeah, so that was part of my
uh,
projection
expense right
process.
now.
So, but
Just so nobody misinterprets this
Yep.
and maybe watching, we try to encumber
Yeah.
as much of salaries and benefits as possible so that we can project out the fund balance at the end of the year. But some of these things are moving targets like club advisors,
Yeah.
curriculum work, other things that
And
people
that was-
overtime actually do. So you
Mhm.
can't really know exactly what that expense is going to be. But my point was that in some cases, you make a decision not to fill a position to put yourself in a better position for the following school year. In some cases, you can't do that because if the teaching assistant is required because it's on an IEP, you have to provide it to the student.
Mhm.
So you can't always do that, but we do go through that process to make sure that, here we are in January, we've lived without it for half the year. Can we, if it's a compliance issue, we have to do it. If it's a student need that is important, we need to do it. And then we have contractual issues that sometimes prevent us from reducing in a certain area because it may impact somebody else. So we look at all of that stuff. In terms of expenses, we bid out where we can.
Mhm.
Contractual expenses, we go out for RFPs on a regular basis.
Mhm.
That's another thing that we do on a regular basis to reduce expenses. In our negotiations, we're not in a negotiations mode right now. We look for ways for savings that help us to be more efficient, including cost sharing related to health insurance. And we've done that in the past. So there are lots of things that we have done historically to reduce expenses. But as everybody knows, everything costs more right now, and we've been in an inflationary period. And we've been in a particular interesting period in that we've come through COVID-19 and the pandemic, and there are some changes in workforce needs that districts are experiencing that are causing us to have to be more competitive about some of the salaries we offer and some of the things of that. So it's all balancing act in terms of, what can you reduce?
Right.
And
Mhm.
as you're looking at, trying to raise more local revenue and also take advantage of the state aid that's available.
Exactly. So my projections assume that we fill all those
Right.
positions. So as time moves on, that may not happen, or there may be other decisions, or there's just not people that, we're able to bring
They're
in.
not filled, not
Yeah.
because we've chosen not to fill
Right.
them. In many cases, we haven't been
So-
able to find people.
And I just want to say it is a tough conversation. And I think even last year when it was proposed, we had feedback, against not filling positions. So I just want to say just that it's very important, even how we approach those conversations. It's important, the expenditures we approve in the meantime. right? I'm just saying, like, just how we approach, how we think about it, how we communicate about it is very important. And I think as far as possible, I believe we should prioritize our current service levels as much as possible, not saying that, but as a target, right? Like the situations are the situations, right? But I think as a goal, I think that should be the target. And then it's just a matter of, what can we do? Can we
Right.
maintain at that level?
Right.
And yeah.
Couple things
And-
that have not happened yet that drive what we can do. We don't have kindergarten registration completed until March, so we don't know actually how many kindergarten students are going to be coming in, and that equates to how many teachers we're going to need. I do know that regionally, there is some sharing going on right now among superintendents regarding class sizes. That started this week because everybody's in the same boat. So that will be another tough conversation that we're going to have. There's also retirements. What's the impact of retirements going to be? Those deadlines for being eligible for the retirement incentive within the teacher's contract are February 1st. That has an impact on what the staffing is going to cost next year. So there are a lot of unknown variables right now, but we're kind of working from a framework of, preserving programs, cutting expenditures, looking at revenues. Tax conversation is going to have to be one that we're going to have. And then where is it that we can, where if we would have to reduce positions, I'm not saying that we're doing that yet. How can we utilize the positions we have to be as efficient as possible? And any business and organization has to do that. So, and I think all these conversations are similar to what other districts are starting to have right now.
Mhm.
But in our class size projections right now look equal to or better than most of the district's information that I've seen. So there's a lot that needs to be put together. The high school schedule needs to be put together and to see how those classes will be impacted in middle school. But there's a lot of things that we'll be bringing to you to have those difficult decisions, give you as much information as possible to work with and our clear recommendations.
When do you start conversations with your admins?
We started that process. Actually, we've been having budget
Last
meetings
week and
last
this
week
week.
into this week.
And the
And
message consistent with what you're telling us here.
yes, don't ask for much more than what we have this year is the message. In some cases, there are asks that may be necessary.
Right.
But it's really a similar message as to last year, which is, it will be a positive scenario if we maintain what we have. Don't ask for a lot of extra things. But when you have a growing population, for example, increasing E&L, E&L students, and we're split over 2 buildings, there may be needs there. In some cases, we look at how can we use the existing staff across the district differently than they're scheduled this year. Special education support, related services support, psychologists, those kinds of areas. We look at ways that we can distribute those. And one of the parameters you said, well, making sure that we're being equitable. We try to be equitable in that process because a principal is requesting more counseling time or more psychologist time or more academic intervention services. That doesn't mean we have to add that to the budget. We look at the student data and say, okay, well, what's the distribution of those staff members going to be over the building next year? So we go through that whole process before we say, okay, we need to add.
What does the budget process look like moving forward? So this is a great brief, but then is this a standing item now, or do we have a conversation, like carve out time once a month? Or
I think there'll be a budget discussion item almost at every meeting.
Okay.
I would anticipate the next meeting, if we have the state aid run, which is the report of what our district will receive. And after Jennifer has analyzed it from the governor's standpoint, because as Mike said, the aid projections on the expense driven aids aren't always accurate in terms of what. So we would give you a report as soon as we had it prepared of what the starting point is from the state level in terms of state aid. And then, we have to prioritize and look at the requests that are coming from the departments and the buildings and determine how those, which one we would recommend supporting. Bring it to you for your ideas on that. We look at, Jennifer does a really detailed look at, well, what were the budget lines last year in the budget compared to actual expenditures last year? And do we maintain that? Do we increase that? Do we decrease that? That's a whole process that has to happen. So almost every meeting, there'll be some iteration of a budget discussion.
Jeff, in your conversations with Questar, everyone here saw the chart, obviously, about not so much the numbers of the student population, the declines.
Right.
And I know the BOCES budget's adopted.
February,
Are the rates
actually, a week from Friday, we'll have an understanding of where Questar is looking to set their rates, how their administrative budget that we share with the
Right.
entire region based on our WADA.
Which is my point, is that because of the declining
I can say
population, it's a bigger impact on our
Yes.
budget because of the slice we have as a
So-
percentage. I just want to be sure that those conversations at your level happen, that
Yeah, Gladys
sensitivity
reached out
has to be-
today, actually, and invited the chairs of each of the committee to meet with Harry Agenel, who is
Because our increases have been
right,
heavy for the last couple of
right,
years.
to go over the preliminary budget for
Mhm.
Questar, and then she, I would imagine, would be rolling it out to the superintendents at one of our meetings.
Yes.
Because our population has remained stable and other districts have declined in the formula, this is what Mike's talking about, in terms of the sharing that we do with BOCES services, our portion of the share goes up.
With
Even
the-
if we're not buying more services or admitting more kids into BOCES programs, the percentage of the overall increase, we pay more
It's
of
a
it.
major impact.
Yes.
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 Because we want to provide those opportunities for our students.
Right.
Of course. The thing is, we're paying a bigger share, portion of that revenue budget and those costs.
Right.
And there has to be some kind of balance.
Yes.
Because I just think that, going back to Mike Loss's presentation and the whole harmless and those changes, how, districts haven't had to make harder decisions about their budgets. And, we're making decisions as I think as a district that's a high performing district, given what we ask our taxpayers too to support it, that we don't want to be penalized because of
Right.
this supporting other districts in the
Correct.
region.
Yeah.
Right, because, we're trying to provide those opportunities and they're not making those, what I think is those, and they may be, I don't know, I'm not part of the district discussions, those hard decisions that they may need to make that impact their district.
Be assured we'll have those discussions, Mr. Pino.
thanks.
Be assured.
But I just wanted to bring that up as a.
That's good. The other thing
It's
with
an expenditure
BOCES
driver.
services, okay, we have high levels of participation in the Questar programs that's consistent with the district's goals to provide options for kids. We have the highest number of kids at the STEM high school at Hudson Valley. We have a large number of kids at Tech Valley High School. We have the largest number of kids in career and technical education. And those are the things we want to maintain for students as options and choices, but you got to pay for them. We also probably have the largest budget of for Questar, or close to it.
Yeah, probably Troy.
Probably us or Troy.
Mhm.
And the other thing to keep in mind with BOCES programs, not that I'm advocating to reduce them, 'cause I'm not,
Oh, right, because there could
but
be an
you cut a
unintended.
BOCES program, even an administrative service, you lose the A the next year. So you hit
Mhm.
yourself on the revenue. So there are good cuts that are smart cuts and there are cuts that are not smart. And a not smart cut is to cut something that's going to drive revenue for you. So if you're purchasing computers through BOCES, which will be part of some information that we present to you, or copiers, it makes sense to buy them through BOCES because you're going to get at your BOCES aid ratio, those revenues back on the revenue side of the budget.
Mhm.
I know of districts that eliminate some of that stuff and then they wind up in the next year and they say, well, what happened to our revenue?
Actually,
Because
that's
you cut
where,
the wrong things.
right, and that's where even opportunities to maybe shift things.
Right. Because there are
too,
things that we're doing
because
on
it
our own that we
generates
can do
different
through
revenue.
BOCES. We should do those things too.
Mhm.
And I think that regionalization planning,
Right.
whatever the outcome of that is, that we're a district that people would want to look to
Right.
share with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
If BOCES doesn't provide the service. Absolutely.
And on that regionalization conversation, the state got a lot of negative feedback from other regions of the state that mischaracterized the regionalization. So Long Island, for example, got nervous that regionalization was code word for consolidating the school districts. So because of some of that feedback that they received, they made it optional for districts to submit their plans. But Questar superintendents had a really great experience in collaborating with one another at Questar. And we said, we want to go forward with this regardless of whether the state wants us to submit a plan or not. And actually, we're bringing in Gladys is bringing in somebody on Friday who has some ideas about how we can regionalize to enhance student achievement. So I think and somebody from through AASA. So we're going to go forward with volunteer collaboration. So anyways, Jen, sorry.
Okay. I mean, that pretty much, wraps up my presentation. I don't know if there's any other questions. As Mr. Simons indicated, there will be additional information. Probably one of the next steps is just taking a look at if just contractually roll everything forward. What is that baseline expense look like? We'll have a better sense of what revenues look like to understand what that gap is. This will feed into that conversation before we even, talk about, is there any other changes that need to be made? So those are some of the next steps. Obviously, the next meeting is next week. The state budget comes out next week. So I don't anticipate anything super new for next week's agenda, but after that, we'll have additional information. So.
Just curious, respectively, when the governor announces what's on her radar, how she wants to approach the budget, and then it's like a negotiation process, right? Where things can change again, right? Last year, I think the governor had an approach, and then the light date she negotiated with the legislature, and things changed approaching budget season. And I just want to say, just keeping that in mind, that even what occurs next week is subject to,
That's right.
And Simon McDonald is coming to our
February 12th.
February board meeting, and he'll give us,
Virtually or?
he's going to strive to try to be here in person. Could wind up being a virtual thing. I'm not sure.
And then for Samantha's benefit, in the past, we've had combined meetings, budget workshop with the regular meeting. I mean, I think if there's a discussion, it's some in-depth, because folks are newer, you may have to look at that schedule just to help support the information and decisions you may have to think about as far as we go forward.
This is great.
Not that I want more meetings.
Yeah.
It is helpful to have that separated.
I think this is beneficial, and I'm glad the board members asked for it because it kind of gives you all where we're at right now and brings everybody to an equal
Especially with
information
information
level.
yeah.
And doing it early and
Thanks for all the work.
having the tax cap early, Jen, is really
Yeah.
gives us a
It was
boundary to work
necessary
within.
from what I was looking at. So
Yeah.
my advantage.
Okay, very good.
So thank you.
Nice
Thank
job.
you, Mike Loss, for joining us. I just have to say, so us as district, business officials, the state aid planning services, they provide so much support, if there's ever any questions for us. It's obviously very complicated. They've been great. So Mike, thank you so much for
Thanks,
joining
Mike.
us tonight. All right.
Excellent.
That's all.
We do have to need
Thank
an
you.
executive session.
Not really usual.
So, yeah, so we're gonna have a need for an executive session. Is there a motion to go into executive session?
It's for the purpose of discussing personnel and employment matters related to more than one individual.
All right, Mr. Buno first, Ms. Steinbeck as a second, all in favor? Everyone's in favor, motion passes.